Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the Neanderthal species that went extinct some 40,000 years ago, a species that is so closely related to our own that many of us have Neanderthal DNA within us. We're going to talk about the history of our discovery of the Neanderthal, but we're also going to talk about the Neanderthals themselves, including their cognitive abilities and, yes, even their culture. My guest for this conversation is Dr. Wragg Sykes. She's an archaeologist, author, and honorary fellow in the School of Archaeology, Classics, and Egyptology at the University of Liverpool. She is also co-founder of Trowelblazers, which is a project that highlights women archaeologists, paleontologists, and geologists. She is the author of the book Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death, and Art. She joins me over Zoom. Wragg Sykes, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you. Excited about this conversation because I've enjoyed preparing for our conversation very much and many great things to dive into. I want to begin with just our knowledge of, and the history of our knowledge of the Neanderthal. We first discovered a skeletal remains of the Neanderthal, somewhere in the middle of the 1800s. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually, for several different reasons, the history of how we rediscovered the Neanderthals in a way, because we first met them, during the last ice age. But the first sort of recognized discovery where some bones were actually found and realized to be very, very ancient, happened in 1856 in Germany. And that's where we get the species name from, actually, because this happened in a cave in the Neanderthal. So Tal is German for valley, so it's the Neander Valley. And that was the first scientific recognition that Neanderthals were a kind of human, and with the chronology that they understood at the time, it was very, very, very old. They didn't have sort of a finer way to split time than that, really, in that sense. That was material that came out because of industrial development, actually. So that valley, the Neanderthal, had been like a beauty spot for hundreds of years. People visited, artists, composers, and subsequently to that, in the early 19th century, because of the limestone in the geology, which was began to be exploited quite heavily for marble and limestone, basically the caves and the river gorge began to be pretty much destroyed. And the cave where the Neanderthal remains came from, it was all full of like clay and sort of just junk that they didn't actually want. So they were blasting that out with black powder. And in amongst that clay was where the remains of what at that time was thought to be just one Neanderthal. Subsequently, people went back relatively recently and looked at the remaining piles of stuff at the site, and they found that there had been other Neanderthals there too. But in the 19th century, archaeological methods were only just coming into being. So literally they were blasting it out. And it was quarry workers who actually noticed that this was not animal remains, which they were finding, in lots of places. The bones of animals, including extinct species, were all being found across Europe for decades before that. But this was recognized as something a little bit different. And those remains were sent to a teacher who was involved with the local Natural History Society, as part of the Victorian thing for learned societies that was, very much sort of blossoming at the time. And he then sent it on to an anatomist, and then it was recognized. So that initial find was some bones from the body, from different parts of the body, but it wasn't a whole skeleton, plus the top of the skull and the brow ridges. So it kind of was from the brows up. So the face was just not there. But that was still enough for them to see that it was human, of a sort, and the condition of the bones is what told them it was really old. But I said it was the first recognized Neanderthal because there were older discoveries actually during the earlier part of the 19th century, but they were not recognized till after the German one. So it's kind of a little bit backwards and forwards in terms of what's found when and at what point, you know, people were able to actually be ready to recognize that this was something different. And that's really fascinating.
Did people quickly realize this was another species that might be closely related to ours? And I also want to follow that up with, how is it received? I couldn't help but thinking while I was listening to you about an old story, Gilgamesh, our oldest story. When we found the tablets that showed that they had the flood story long before the Hebrew Bible would, and that was probably taken from there. It was very controversial. We're talking about the same century here. How was it? How did people respond to finding this different but closely related species?
I mean, I think that's a really intriguing sort of thing to think about. You know, the first known Neanderthal bones that we know of that were actually found were from the 1830s in Belgium. And they were dug up not by industrial working or mining. That was actually somebody who was really interested in looking at all the stuff that was coming out of caves, extinct animals. So he was excavating for that reason. And he found remains which included, again, like a piece of skull and a little bit of upper jaw of a Neanderthal child. But because Neanderthal children, a bit like us, you know, their faces look a lot more delicate when they're young. They sort of grow into the large brow ridges and stuff. So that was not really distinctively different to anatomical understanding at the time. So that wasn't really recognized at all. Then sort of just over 10 years later, in 1840, in Gibraltar, this was in a military context here. The British army were in Gibraltar sort of building stuff, making fortifications and things. And as part of that, there was a lot of quarrying going on. And if you've ever been to Gibraltar or seen it, it's really quite a small promontory out from the south coast of Spain, but it's formed of this immense rock, all limestone. It's just like riddled with caves and things like this. There are actually many caves from that rock with Neanderthal archaeology, and there's several, and 2 sites where we have actual remains of Neanderthals, and one of them is this quarry called Forbes Quarry. So the context for that discovery, we don't actually know who found that, but we know the name of the person who it was given to. So in this case, it was a whole skull, so there's a face, and it was an officer in the regiment, so they had their own scientific society. So the officers, you know, they were generally more educated, able to access, again, that kind of scientific natural history society, you know, people interested in botany and things. There were officers running around sampling insects and things. And as part of the meetings of the scientific society, we can see an entry in their minutes where this skull was presented. And it's from Forbes Quarry, but we don't know anything else about how that was found. Despite it being a whole skull, it still was not recognized as anything out of the ordinary. There's nothing else in the minutes that say like a strange skull or just a skull. Now, when you look at the photographs, the first photographs we have of that are from the 1860s, it's covered in concretions. So it may be that masked its weirdness, but it's probably also just because people in the 1840s were not primed to be expecting the existence of ancient human relations. People had only just found extinct primate fossils 10 years before that in Europe, you know, where there are no such native primate species now in that sense. So I think people just weren't really ready for it. And sort of the decades go on, this skull is kept in Gibraltar, looked after, but not sort of studied or, you know, seen as anything out of the ordinary, because many caves in Gibraltar, as I said, they're all full of incredible archaeology, other skeletons from different periods. So it didn't really stand out. And it took the visit by chance of a doctor, Thomas Hodgkin, who was there as the personal doctor of a VIP who happened to be visiting Gibraltar, and they were given a tour of the Scientific Society's collections, and he noticed it. And being a doctor, with presumably more sort of up-to-date, intensive anatomical knowledge, he saw that this was quite strange. But not only that, this is the 1860s now, 1863 he visited. This is after that Neanderthal discovery in Germany. So now the existence of ancient humans is something that's possible. And he happened, Thomas Hodgkin, to be friends, or at least an acquaintance with, a very interesting, fascinating man called George Busk, who was at the heart of many of these learned societies in Britain. And he had been the person who did the translation into English from that German find. So sort of all these little threads come together, and the skull from Gibraltar is shipped to England, arrives, and it's sort of being considered by various important people, including George Busk and also Thomas Huxley. So these are all people who were really publishing key papers on sort of these nascent ideas about evolution, all friends with Darwin as well. They were all corresponding. You can look up the Darwin Letters website. There's like transcribed letters. All these people are there. And they are all considering what this skull means. And there's even sort of some consideration, or maybe we should name it, call it Homo calpicus, which was like the old name for Gibraltar. But they were pipped to the post because somebody else, William King, who was actually more like a geologist, he, on the basis of the skull from Germany, sort of presented a discussion on this at a scientific society and proposed a name, Homo neanderthalensis, based on that German site. So that is why it's called that, because although that Gibraltar find had been discovered first, it wasn't recognized till after the species name had been given. So because we have this sort of system of, whoever names first, that gets priority. So otherwise we could be talking about Homo calpicus, which is, just all of these things together about the serendipity of the discoveries, the fact that somebody had to be there with the right anatomical knowledge in Gibraltar to send that skull over. There's just so many really fascinating sort of places where chance meets with what people are able to recognize and to see from their own experience.
Was the find of it at all controversial because it may suggest a different Earth history from what the Bible presented?
Yes. There was already a long history of sort of accumulating scientific evidence that the chronology suggested in biblical accounts could not account for what we can see written in the rocks, just the amount of time that it must take for deposits of rock to build up. And then in particular, sort of from the late 1700s, people were finding and publishing examples where there were huge deposits of rock that built up. And then they could see that rock had been eroded out. There had been a huge gap of time. Then more rock had been laid on top. And based on looking at the rates of sedimentation today in rivers and things like this, it became plain that the amount of time required to form the Earth and the history of the other Earth sort of surfaces that had to have existed in the past was just immense, and kind of terrifyingly immense, actually, I think, to people at the time. So there already was a context for recognizing that Earth's history was far, far deeper than human historical accounts were suggesting. But the deep time and the existence of other forms of life. For example, we also have the whole emergence of understanding about dinosaurs and extinct marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs. Mary Anning, the really famous fossil finder and seller, she was working in the early 19th century, and it was clear from her work and lots of other people that there had been whole vanished worlds of these creatures as well. So the idea that there had been vanished forms of life was also there, but sort of actually bringing everybody's minds to the brink of thinking, well, maybe there were vanished kinds of humans that were different forms of humans that were sort of something more primitive than us, that might connect us to the other apes that we see. That was, really quite a leap, I think still for people. On the other hand, people were imagining it. There was not sort of necessarily any clear scientific predictions that these things would be found, but people were already imagining sort of ideas of primitive humans, they would call them, from the 1830s onwards. And they basically illustrate them as, halfway between like an orangutan and a human. So there is a contradiction in that the scientific aspect wasn't quite ready, to go that far, but people actually are still imagining this possibility, sort of in an artistic sense. But when the Neanderthals were first recognized, absolutely, they were a sensation. And it's quite interesting that even people with relatively similar anatomical knowledge and qualifications would come to quite different, I guess, interpretations of what the fossils meant. As I said, in the Neanderthal find, certainly in the cave, the bones were regarded as looking really, in terms of their condition, that they had to have been there for a long time. But that didn't stop some people who were very renowned scientists and pathologists saying, actually, no, this just looks like the remains of somebody who, is sick or, had rickets, which is why the legs are slightly, bowed compared to Homo sapiens legs. Or, just coming up with explanations to do with disease and focusing on that this individual is just a weird person with various things wrong with them. And that's the explanation. But then that didn't make sense when something else pops up in Gibraltar. Suddenly at that point, it's like, well,
there's another one. There's another one.
Yeah, exactly. Hang on. So I think at that point, the idea that the Neanderthal bones were just sort of diseased and weird, that began to kind of crumble a little bit. It did take a while, though, for more complete sort of skulls with bones to appear, and also for artifacts to be found along with the bones. So between the Neanderthal discovery in 1856, it took until the 1880s for there to be any clear stone tools found alongside Neanderthal bones, which was from a Belgian site. So that's a huge amount of time during which the Neanderthals were understood to have existed as ancient relatives of humans, but there was no consensus on, did they have culture or not? And it's really funny because some of the first reconstruction drawings of them, they're actually represented with quite sophisticated culture, with worked skins and even, a hafted axe. So like with a long handle and a stone axe sort of tied on and wedged on. And technologically, that's actually, rather further extended than just bashing stones. So people were already giving them those attributes without there being any archaeology yet found. So I always find that quite interesting that in some ways the early ideas about Neanderthals were a bit more generous than they became a little bit later.
And that's very interesting. I think people might be surprised if they were to look at the title of your book. And again, we are talking to Dr. Rebecca Wragg Sykes about her book, Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death, and Art. To see in the subtitle, Love and Art, may surprise some people.
Well, I mean, I wanted to write this book to present, I guess, a definitive account of what can we say about all different sorts of aspects of Neanderthal life. Basically, it's like anything you might want to know about a Neanderthal, I've tried to pop it in. And, some things we can say a lot about, others less so. But, if you take the word love, what does love mean? It's an emotional attachment that you feel to people who have close meaning to you, whether they are blood relatives or not. And I think listeners would recognize that there's many ways to love, but also that animals can experience emotions that are akin to that feeling. I think research into dogs is quite clear that they have extremely strong emotional attachments to their owners. They live in packs. It's based on emotional relations. And then if you look at our closest evolutionary relatives who are alive, which is chimpanzees and bonobos, their society is entirely ruled by emotion. And some of that is aggression, but a lot of it is about care and enjoying affectionate interactions with each other. So I didn't see a problem with using the word love for Neanderthals, because I think we can absolutely assume that Neanderthals had emotional lives as rich as chimpanzees do, and far more, because they are much closer to us in an evolutionary sense than chimpanzees are at all. We share a last common ancestor with the lineage that would end up in chimpanzees 7 million years ago, something like that. Whereas our last common ancestor with Neanderthals is sort of only 500,000 to 700,000 years ago, much less, vastly less in terms of time. So we should expect, on that basis, Neanderthals to be very similar. And then you look at their bodies and the size of their brains, and their brains on average are as large, if not potentially larger. There's a question about that based on whether we have more males or females, because the size sort of affects it slightly. But basically, they have brains which look as intensely developed in terms of emotional processing and things like that. So I think in that sense, of course, we can talk about Neanderthals loving each other and loving us, maybe.
And we'll talk about that too. And that's an important aspect as well. But I guess, we like to romanticize love, but I imagine, but I suspect love is a very powerful emotion to have for survival.
Yeah, I mean, love is what, at the end of the day, love is just a name for attachment. And, that is one of the things that drives the incredible sort of drive of maternal protection. It's that feeling of desperate need to protect. That's a kind of love. I think there's a difference between the way that we, classify and, I guess, formalize what we mean about love. Is it friendly love? Is it love for one's partner? Is it love for culture? But all of those things actually are about that racing heart feeling, that lifted up feeling. And that's basically chemistry in your body. That's what the feelings actually are. And those feelings can be evoked by all sorts of things. So, yeah, I think talking about the different flavors of Neanderthal love, I do try and do that in the book. What were the things that might have frightened Neanderthals? What are the things that we can imagine that they really enjoyed, that felt really good to them? And I think, you mentioned the title as well, Kindred. It took a long time to get the title for this book. It had other sort of iterations which didn't work, and then suddenly that jumped out at me one day, and I thought that is the perfect title for this book, because they are literally our kindred in an evolutionary sense, in that they're part of the hominin family tree we belong to. But because there is also huge amounts of evidence now for later periods of interbreeding between us, there's also this other kind of kindred relationship we have with them, that we carry that DNA from interbreeding much later, after we had separated those two lineages, theirs and ours had separated. And then there's the whole idea of kindred spirits, that if you met a Neanderthal, would they not only look pretty human, but would it feel like you were interacting with a person? And so that's also what I was trying to evoke with the title. And I mean, it's been wonderful, sort of the reception of the book, and there are 19 translations now. But what's been really funny is in some languages, there isn't a word that exactly matches kindred. And when I was in Spain in October, giving some talks about this, including at the Museum of Human Evolution in Burgos, there was a great discussion with one of the researchers there who was saying, you know, I wish Spanish had a word that matched that, because it's so perfect for the way that we think about Neanderthals now in all these different aspects. And yeah, so it was really nice to kind of discuss how language actually can form what we can say and think about Neanderthals as well.
What do we know about the potential, I guess, cognitive abilities of the Neanderthal, and how do we know it for a species that went extinct some 40,000 years ago?
Yeah, this is one of the things that is complicated about Neanderthals and about understanding Neanderthals. And it's also one of the big drivers why I wanted to write this book, because people like me who spend, you know, our professional lives thinking about this all the time, we have sort of an array of information going back decades in our minds that builds up this picture and it allows us to argue for sort of certain levels of cognition. But that's actually really difficult for people, you know, everyday person who reads, say, a headline claiming something about Neanderthals, and they're like, well, where's this coming from? You know, if the headline's like, oh, Neanderthals weren't so stupid after all, well, they're like, well, what did we know before, and what does this mean, and how much can you actually say with little scraps of stuff? And that's kind of what I wanted to, I guess, use the book to do, is to show just the enormous synthesis of information from all different aspects of archaeology and of research on Neanderthals that together paint a picture of them as really quite cognitively sophisticated. So I mentioned already their brains and the size of the skull. You know, that's a lot of computing power. Brains are also very expensive, sort of on an energetic level, to run. So if you're evolving a really big brain, you're doing something important with it that is part of your everyday life. And if you plot sort of, you know, 4 million years of hominin fossils, all different species, like there's about 15 different hominin species now, so ancient human relations. Neanderthals are right up there with us in terms of the brain size compared to the body. So they're processing something with those brain computers, and it can't just be about social relations. Other things are going on in their lives that require that level of processing. If we look at, I guess, you know, like you could pick anything in terms of the archaeology and the evidence we have for their culture. Stone tools, I think, are something that's interesting to try and write about for people who maybe don't have any experience of stone tool technology and the way archaeologists deal with that. Because number one, Neanderthals were not just bashing stuff together. The way that they understood stone as a material and the way that they had sort of literally at their fingertips many different methods to take stone apart systematically in a way that, you know, if you watch a modern person working stone, so we call that napping. If you watch a modern napper as they are producing stone, the sophistication and the thinking ahead in terms of, if I take this flake off, that's going to set me up with another little area that I can hit and take another flake off. We can see that same level of sort of planning and the ability to think several steps ahead in dealing with this block of stone. We see it in Neanderthals as well. So they are absolutely not primitive in the stone tool technologies that they had. They had a lot of different kinds of stone technologies, including blades, for example, which are basically long and thin flakes. They were systematically in some times and places making blades, also stone points. So you can see sort of a whole variety of different ways just of interacting with the stone. They never, move bad quality rock into regions with good quality rock. So they understand the geology. They have obviously territories over which that they were active, and they were able to recognize that if you're going to a sort of a valley with good flint, you're not going to take some horrible quartzite with you because there's no point. So there's this real impression of them as sort of material connoisseurs, I guess, that comes out the more you look at what they're doing and you dive deeper. And you see that not only with stone, but wood, for example. Obviously, stone tools, we have, literally millions of stone tools made by Neanderthals from the hundreds and hundreds of sites that we have for them. Organic objects, so stuff made from bone, is a little bit more common. There's all sorts of bone remains from the animals they ate, but there's also pieces of bone that they would use to work stone tools. And occasionally we see formed, sort of actually, vaguely carved and shaped bone tools as well, but they're not very common. But even more rarely preserved are wooden tools. But we do have those. We have a number of sites where we've got spears. And what's really, really cool is that the same concern for the quality of the material that you see with stone, it's there in how they are understanding different tree species, different parts of the tree even, as being the best part for the tip of your spear or things like that, or the tip of your digging stick.
There's a level of complexity there, right? Because I'm imagining you have to be able to use a stone tool to make another tool. So they're using one tool to produce a different tool. Yeah,
and this is really cool because when you think about it, it's a process of mental hierarchy. You have to have a stage before you can do this other thing, and then you can do this other thing. So that's true for using stone tools to make wood. But then there's a whole other realm of stuff that they're also doing, which is composite technology, where you stick different parts together to make a multi-part tool. And cognitively, that is pretty sophisticated. You have to be able to envision that final object and then bring together those different parts. And in some cases, we can even see that they are manufacturing glue. So birch bark glue, which, you guys have birch, different species in the States, but the process is very similar. You cook it out of the bark. They're using that. And also we had a recent find from an Italian site where they're using pine resin, coniferal pine resin, but mixing it with beeswax, because pine resin by itself is not so good. Birch tar is much better. If you want to get properties much more like birch tar, mixing pine resin with beeswax does the job really well. So you can see not only joining things together, but actually mixing substances into a new substance, which will have a new material property. So all of that together, that's extremely sophisticated. And I find it very strong evidence that, if you had brought a Neanderthal to where we live now today, they would be fascinated by all the materials that we have around us every day. And they would want to know what you could do with them all and how you make them.
That's interesting. This is Letters of Politics. We are in conversation with archaeologist Rebecca Wragg Sykes. She is the author of the book Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death, and Art. There's evidence that the Neanderthal worked with different colors.
Yeah. This is a part of sort of working on Neanderthals and writing the book that I really enjoyed, actually, because all of the things I've just talked about with how we can see Neanderthals really understanding materials and properties and wanting to experiment and change things. That really is a great basis for understanding the evidence that we have for, you can say art, but I try to use the word aesthetics really as a different way of engaging with materials. Not what can this material do for me as a tool, but what can this material do to change something else? So like if you have sort of mineral pigments, and we have evidence from a lot of Neanderthal sites now that they were collecting mineral pigments and rubbing them on things, that's changing the surface where that color is rubbed on. And in fact, you can use mineral pigments. People might have heard it called ochre, red ochre, for example. You can use that for a lot of practical purposes. It can be used in hide preparation. You can make sunscreen out of it if you mix it with fat. It can be mixed in these glues for the multi-part tools that I told you about. Neanderthals were not doing that with the glues, so far as we know. But they were rubbing it on things. We can see that because of the abraded surfaces on the pieces of pigment themselves. But we also actually have some cases where we have the objects that they were putting the colour on. And in those situations, they seem to be unusual objects that are not really linked with everyday stuff that we can see. So one really nice example that I do talk about in the book is from an Italian site called Grotta Fumane, where it's about 55,000 years old, and it's a little fossil shell. So this itself is unusual because it's not a shell from the sea. It's not food waste. It's being collected as some kind of material curiosity, and that shell had to have been carried 100 kilometers to Fumane because there's no geological deposits nearer than that are of the right age to have these shells. So that's already an unusual object, but it has red pigment on the outside only of the shell, and that pigment was sourced 40 kilometers from a different direction from the cave. So you've got an unusual object with pigment that had been carried or brought, and it's on the outside of the shell. We don't know how long that shell had actually been carried for, where it had gone in the landscape, had it gone to the place where they got the pigment? We don't know any of that. But it has no clear functional everyday survival purpose as an object. And for people who are moving around the landscape without, the means, then they don't have horses to carry stuff for them. They are carrying things themselves on their own bodies. You don't move stuff, even little things like that, without some reason, without it having an importance or a meaning. I'm not saying it had to have a symbolic meaning where it stood for something else or it meant something in a formal way, but it was obviously important to whoever bothered to find that and carry it and put colour on it. Perhaps it was perhaps it was something given to a child to play with. That's actually a really important part of life, giving children things to engage them. Perhaps it was something that was owned or held or given between adults. We can't see the context for that, but it's so unusual in terms of the material that the red colour has been put on. And it's not alone, because we have other sites where we also have shells, for example. In that case, it could be food waste. This is a Spanish site, but the pigment there is a mix of different colours. So again, you kind of have a link back to the glue where they're mixing stuff. And there's also a rather older site, about 130,000 years from Croatia, where there is a number of eagle talons found from this site. It was dug in the Victorian times, so it's, the context for them is not great. We don't know if those talons were all in one little group in the cave or if they were spread out. We don't know that. But one of them has, again, a pigment mix on it. So that's an unusual object with the pigment. So these are just a few examples I've given you. If you put together that broader picture of pigment use and the context of it from lots of different Neanderthal sites, there really does seem to be an impression that they were interested in applying colour to things. And then you can look at other stuff they do in a similar way, where we see they are engraving or incising the surfaces of bones. And that is something that is seen at different sites as well. So together, there's an impression that they're interested in altering things, which is why I kind of call it aesthetics, because we don't have, if listeners are kind of, anybody's ever been to France and visited the painted caves there, from the Ice Age, there's nothing like that from Neanderthal record. We don't have any painted horses on walls. We don't have any carvings that are recognisably of an animal or a person. We have nothing that we could say is a formal piece of art. But what we have is evidence for them having an aesthetic interest in what can these substances do to change things visually. Also, I mean, the other kind of aesthetics is sound, which is so intriguing because we can't directly see any evidence for them making sounds for an aesthetic reason, but potentially that was going on as well.
Do we believe that they spoke languages the way we would?
The way we would, I would say probably not, but did they speak to each other? Did they have some kind of language, as in, was talking important in their everyday life? Yeah, absolutely. I think that's not a controversial thing at all amongst researchers now. There's sort of all the different archaeological evidence that I've been talking about. You can make arguments as to how difficult are the different technologies to learn and to transmit between individuals. Could you actually just watch somebody do some of these sort of complicated tool making things and learn how to do it? Can you just watch somebody making birch tar, or do you need them to tell you how to not make the fire too hot or it will burn the bark? Stuff like this. That's kind of things that you can argue about. We can then say, oh, well, what about hunting? We are assuming with good reason for some of the large animals that Neanderthals were tackling that they were hunting in groups. That implies some kind of cooperation, and potentially cooperation beyond what we see in, for example, wolf packs and things like this. But you can actually go back to Neanderthal bodies as well, and look at evidence that tells us that their ability to produce sound was probably not so different to ours. And certainly they were able to sort of make controlled sound in a way that, for example, chimpanzees can't really do. And their voice box is sort of in the wrong place compared to ours. So Neanderthals much more similar to us. But also really recent work, which has been very cool, about Neanderthal hearing. That is based on analysing really tiny little bones from inside the ear in the skull that's preserved. And you can model the sound frequencies that those bones were tuned into, basically. So the shape of them is a bit different, but that it looks like that's because the general Neanderthal skull shape was different to ours. So they have large brains, but the shape of their brains is different. We have a much more globular balloon-shaped head. Theirs is more swept back. So there are questions as to, although they've got really big brains, is the structure different? But in terms of their hearing, that different skull shape sort of has morphed the bones. But when you model the sound frequencies that they would be able to be listening to best, they are very close to what we are, which is essentially we're tuned into human speech. And so I think together that really strongly suggests that some kind of talk was going on all the time in their lives. And even if you look at the common ancestor again between us and Neanderthals, it's probably there as well, and that language of some form is important. But yeah, when you said talking like we are right now, where we can talk about what happened 50,000 years ago, that is about brains, not just ears and your voice box and your lung capacity, whatever. That's where cognition comes in. And I don't know sort of if Neanderthals would, be able to comprehend some of the things that we talk about in our everyday lives. It's a really interesting, mental exercise to imagine if you met a Neanderthal, what would you talk about? Would they be able, for example, to, discuss what they want to do next week, or, put aside the concept of a week, but in a few days, are they thinking ahead in that sense? Did they have the ability to talk about the future? Could they talk about the past? Or was their language much more based around the here and the now? That's quite difficult to be certain about. But I think what is interesting, and we mentioned it before, is in relation to the evidence for interbreeding between us and Neanderthals. That's only been something that has had evidence for it occurring in the last sort of decade or so. It's that recent that we found out for certain that we did meet Neanderthals, and in some times and places we had sex of some sort, and hybrid children were born, and in some contexts survived. So the interbreeding evidence, I think people assumed that would be happening very close to the end of the Neanderthals' time, that we sort of Homo sapiens as a species left, began to disperse from Africa sort of late on, maybe 50,000, and then by 40,000 Neanderthals are gone. But the chronology for that has completely blown up now, and it looks like Homo sapiens populations were beginning to disperse away from Africa much earlier, sort of 100,000 years plus. So there is a much deeper history of potential contact in Eurasia, and we do see it genetically.
Eurasia is important because is this one of the main spots where we find Neanderthals? I think we find them many places, but is it...
Oh yeah, no, there's no Neanderthal remains outside Western Eurasia. So there are Neanderthals in Wales, where I am, down into France, in the Mediterranean, in the Near East, so right through into Iran, Uzbekistan, sort of off into Central Asia, and then into Siberia as well, but not in Eastern Eurasia. So we don't know the eastern extent, actually, but there's no evidence beyond sort of West Siberia, if you want to put it like that.
And not Africa either.
No, nothing at all. So Neanderthals, we believe, emerged within Eurasia, but that common ancestor that we shared with them somewhere between 500,000 to 700,000 years ago, we don't know where that population lived. They may also have been in Western Eurasia, or they may have been in Africa. Now, the earliest evidence we have for Homo sapiens people is all in Africa so far. So, you kind of get clear anatomical emergence of Neanderthals around 400,000 to 300,000 years ago in Europe and perhaps in Western Asia as well. And around the same time in Africa, you get what is looking like it's becoming Homo sapiens. So those populations seem to have been separate early on, but then later Homo sapiens is moving into Eurasia from at least 200,000 years ago. And they are encountering Neanderthals, and there is interbreeding at least before 200,000 years, and then multiple times after that in time, right up to the end. So there are some remarkable fossils of early Homo sapiens people, so people like us, from around 40 to 45,000 years ago in Europe, and they have evidence for interbreeding with Neanderthals within just a few generations of themselves. Just a few generations back, there's a Neanderthal ancestor. So there definitely is interbreeding late, just before Neanderthals disappear. But there's also, it's happening before that as well, tens of thousands of years before. So when you kind of put this picture together of long-term contact, if we go back to the language question, what is motivating the sex, basically? Is it aggression? Is it curiosity? We don't actually know. But what we can say is that certainly some hybrid children were born and had to survive. And that includes children that were born into and lived with Homo sapiens groups, as in us. So I would think that they had to be able to adapt to the society that was there, which would include language. Because I would think, if we're not sure of the complexity of the content of Neanderthals' language, say 200,000 years ago, when we're talking about early Homo sapiens people, all the evidence that I was talking about with aesthetics and things like this, and an interest in color and patterns and engraving, that's also there from 100,000 years onwards. But it's more complex. It's a bit more complicated than what we see in Neanderthals. So I would think certainly by, the last 10,000 years or so of when Neanderthals are around in Eurasia, between 50 to 40,000 years ago, it's quite possible that the people who were dispersing into Eurasia, meeting Neanderthals late on, interacting with them, interbreeding's happening, it is possible that their language may have been a lot more complicated than that of the Neanderthals. But whatever the case was, the hybrid children were still able to survive, because the genetic legacy that is in living people, all living people, comes from this late interbreeding, about 55,000 years actually, so a little bit before the final interbreeding. But certainly those hybrid children were growing up and being raised within early Homo sapiens groups. So to me, that does suggest there has to be some cognitive compatibility, and potentially an ability to learn that language, or at least to learn how to communicate in that culture, even if it's not anything like the language that Neanderthals had. But yeah, it's all completely fascinating.
Do we know if with interbreeding, was it usually a male Homo sapien and a female Neanderthal, or did it go both ways?
It looks like, the evidence we have is obviously somewhat patchy, because it depends on what fossils we have and whether we're sampling, what we can see from Neanderthal populations and those fossils and things. But I think thus far it looks as if it's going both ways, but perhaps at different times. So later on, Neanderthals with Homo sapiens women. But that might just be about, as I say, about sampling, that we're not able to see the full picture, and perhaps it was more equal all the way through time. We can't really see that for sure. But I think in terms of what's happening later, it's a little clearer based on what the sort of the differences in the genes that we have in us today. But yeah, was there a different social context for those different patterns? And it's very difficult to say, but I think what's fair to say is that we can't assume that violence is going to be the baseline for everything. If we look at what we can see about Neanderthals and how curious they were about their world in general, I would expect them to be really fascinated by meeting another group, and that doesn't necessarily translate into aggression. One of the things that's always interesting is that when we look at primates, if you compare the closest relations we have, chimpanzees, there's two forms of chimpanzees. There's the sort of chimpanzee, the normal one, and then there is bonobos, who are close relations of them. Their social structure is totally different. Chimpanzees are much more aggressively territorial. They don't like strangers. They literally have patrols along their territory edges, and if they spy members of another group and the odds are in their favor in terms of numbers, they will attack them and try and kill them. Bonobos don't do that in anywhere sort of the same level of aggression. They're much more open to amicable relations with strangers. And if we can see sort of that level of difference in chimpanzees and bonobos, I don't see why we should assume that violence and aggression and coercion in terms of the interbreeding is the baseline for how we should be thinking about it. I don't think there's evidence for it. If we look at how Neanderthals' lives themselves were organized, they're living as hunting and gathering peoples, yes, in small groups, sometimes very isolated in genetic terms, so they're in really tiny little populations, other times a bit less so, but still generally more isolated than contemporary early Homo sapiens people. So their populations are just not as well networked. But within those groups, there's no clear evidence that they were sort of, super aggressive to each other. If you look at the way that they had to live, the way that they hunt, again, as I said, we assume that's cooperative. But also, when you look at the butchery process after the hunt's finished, is really systematic. They're homing in on the best bits of the carcass, as I said, like with the stone and the wood. They really know all the best bits. But it's systematic, and it's taken apart, and the good bits are then taken somewhere else to be distributed. What you don't get an impression of is like a scrum at the carcass with sort of just chaos. It's quite different. So, and hearths. Hearths are the centers of Neanderthal living sites, just as they are in our homes. They center the social world. So the impression is that it's much more a recognizable, interactive social world. So the potential for them to be open to relations with others should at least be as possible as aggression, I think, and that we mustn't assume that it's just one.
We're at the end of our time, but just quickly, does everyone today have Neanderthal DNA within them?
Yeah, what we understand now is that everybody alive has some Neanderthal DNA, but the percentage differs. What we think is that during those dispersals of early Homo sapiens, people were dispersing away from Africa. That's when they encountered Neanderthals in Eurasia. So those populations that then have living descendants in Eurasia, Australia, in the Americas, they have higher percentages. Whereas the populations of Homo sapiens people who remained in Africa, they were not directly interacting with Neanderthals, but they do have some Neanderthal DNA because later movements back into Africa then brought that material in again. So they it's like secondhand, as it were. But yes, so it's the Neanderthals are there in everybody, but the proportions is different between different populations. And, there could be 20 to 50% of the Neanderthal genome in us today, but in different parts. So there's kind of more Neanderthal around now in terms of mass than there ever probably was walking around on the earth, but it's inside us.
That's interesting. Interesting to think about. More mass today than ever before. Rebecca Wragg Sykes has been our guest. She's an archaeologist, author, and honorary fellow in the School of Archaeology, Classics, and Egyptology at the University of Liverpool. She is also co-founder of Trowelblazers, which is a project that highlights women archaeologists, paleontologists, and geologists. She has joined us for a conversation on her book, Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death, and Art. Rebecca Wragg Sykes, I could have went many more hours with this conversation, but I'm extremely thankful to be able to have this hour with you today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.